Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter at vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. You can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod and patronize me. This is kind of a weird episode. I say that about every episode nowadays, but this one's a little funny just because you are catching me at the end of a crisis of faith, I guess. Going into this last weekend, I was pretty down and starting to consider abandoning the show. I'd lost a couple of guests I was supposed to have. They were authors who were coming from overseas for various reasons, generally because they were busy. Each one of them had to cancel. I went into Friday with no guest lined up for today's show, which always kind of gives me anxiety. On top of that, download numbers haven't been great. The day job's been really hectic. I started sort of falling into the double trap of self-pity and self-aggrandizement, which is very difficult to do at the same time, but, I manage. Where I started to wonder what I was really doing this for and whether it would matter if I stopped. And that's part of the self-pitying thing. The self-aggrandizement comes when I talk about my day job and the value of that and this and its relative lack of audience. And again, it's a pretty complicated matrix of wallowing. And the upside is I was kind of wondering what would happen if I just didn't put up a show this Tuesday. Friday, I remembered a guest who I had on the great spreadsheet that knows all, who we just had a tentative plan to get together this spring. And so I dropped him a line, and he came through, said we could get together Sunday, and we did. And that was fantastic. I drove an hour and a half each way to his place, which we'll talk about soon, and had a really wonderful conversation. And I think part of my anxiety about the show came from a couple of the recent episodes weren't as good as I'd hoped they would be, and that's partly just the conversation and some of the parameters of who I was talking to and how and what I could say, and I started to wonder if I was sort of losing my my ability to do this show. So yeah, there was a lot of wallowing and a lot of self-criticism. But anyway, this past Sunday, went down to Pennsylvania, had a fantastic time with our guest, drove away thinking, I really needed that. It was very, very worthwhile conversation. The thing that prefaces it, though, that was Sunday. And on Saturday, I went into New York City for the Antiquarian Book Fair at the Park Avenue Armory. I had pitched an antiquarian bookseller on doing the show a couple of weeks ago. He's down in Silver Spring, Maryland, somewhat close to where I go for my big FDA meetings that I do for my day job, which is just massively more important than this. I'm kidding. And we're figuring we'll get together at some point, but he said he'd be up here for the fair. He got me a comp pass, so I went. I'd never been to an antiquarian book fair before. Had a wonderful time. Saw all sorts of great books that if I had titanic amounts of money, I would buy. But I also connected with that bookseller and had a really nice conversation, made our tentative plans for the future when I'm down in Silver Spring. But I also met a couple of other people who became prospective pod guests. One was a bookseller at another bookstore who I knew I had seen before somewhere and couldn't figure out where. And he's a very distinctive looking guy and dresses very well. And I was just flummoxed trying to remember where I'd seen this guy before. And when I was going through his employer's booth, I suddenly saw, well, I saw a book that suddenly snapped it together. He had a couple of books by Samuel Delany on display there, a book of his about Tom Dish's poetry. Basically, I saw that and realized I knew this guy from ReaderCon, the great literary science fiction and fantasy event up in Massachusetts that I go to and record at. And so when I bumped into the guy later on, I introduced myself, we shot the breeze, had a really nice conversation, and I pitched him on the show, and he said, well, yeah, but I can do it the end of 2017, early 2018, because I have this big event that I'll be doing then, and it'll be really good to do the podcast right around the time that's going to open. And at that point, I thought, holy crap, I need to keep doing this show till the end of 2017 or 2018. Fantastic. So that gave me something to look forward to. And then on the way out, and this is going to be a weirder story, I was finishing up at the book fair, went off to get my bag, went downstairs to the bathroom. I'm on the way out, and an older guy passes me on the way in. And we're both in the doorway. And I had never met him before, but I knew he was an author, and I knew what his name was, and I said it guardedly to see if it was actually him. It was. He turned around, we stopped, and in the doorway of the bathroom, we had a nice conversation about his new book that he's just completed, my podcast, my pitch, etc. I had some of my podcast postcards with me, gave him a couple of those, told him I'd love to sit down and talk with him at some point in future, and he was receptive and up for it and interested, and it was just funny to me that, a guy, I'm not sure how I identified him because I was having trouble with names all day long, just trying to remember certain people. But this guy just walked right past me, and I just, for some reason, knew exactly who it was. So I have a couple of prospective guests coming, which means I have to keep the show going. And that fueled me going into Sunday's podcast. Like I said, after Sunday's conversation, which you're going to listen to in just a few minutes, I felt rejuvenated. I felt good. I felt like I'm doing something for the right reasons. And even if this show doesn't have a huge amount of listeners and, it won't ever generate, revenues, it won't be monetizable, whatever that's supposed to be. This is still what I'm supposed to be doing. One of the other upsides, mysteriously over the last couple of days, a few people contributed to my Patreon for the show. They are seemingly unconnected with each other, so I have no idea why all of a sudden 4 people decided this show is worth putting up some money for, but I do appreciate all of you guys, and that was another thing that kind of made me think, yeah, this is something. There's a reason to keep doing this, not money, but that people know it's there and they're going to keep being part of it. So that brings us to this week's show. Thank you for putting up with that, by the way. It really was a crisis of faith thing for me. I was really feeling going into last weekend like, I don't know who's out there. There's only a few people I know personally who are listening to this show who would be bothered if I wasn't doing it, but I'm going to keep doing it. So our guest this time around is David Leopold. Now, I met David when, the great artist Drew Friedman invited me to a panel that David was hosting at the Artists Union in New York City. And it was going to be on the work and influence of Al Hirschfeld, the great, we'll say caricaturist, but really artist. I'd seen Hirschfeld's work since I was a little kid, as a lot of us in this region of the Northeast did. He was the artist for the New York Times theater, arts and leisure section. He did these wonderful caricatures of various celebrities and actors and actresses. And he'd always hide the name of his daughter, Nina, into his drawings. So you'd have to search for the number of Ninas that were in there, but that's a side thing. But anyway, David hosted this panel that Drew was on discussing Hirschfeld. And I went to the Artists Union. Pretty much the moment I saw Drew, he just pulled me and David together and said, Gil does a great podcast. You need to do a show with him, and kind of walked off. And that connected me and David. That's pretty much the story. I gave him one of my promotional postcards, and we stayed in touch. And going into last weekend, I pitched him and said, if you're around, I'd love to do a show. So that's how we got together. David did a wonderful job running the panel, which also made me feel pretty good. Even on the drive down, I thought, I've seen this guy with a microphone in front of him. He knows what he's doing. So some of the difficulties I had in recent episodes, I didn't think I was going to have this time around. On top of that, I got to read David's book, which is it's called The Hirschfeld Century, Portrait of an Artist and His Age. It's from Knopf. And it includes a massive selection of Hirschfeld's drawings over the decades, and includes an essay for each decade of the 20th century with David's commentary on both somewhat the biography, but also the drawings themselves, the career around him, how at one point it was mainly movie studios and then Broadway. And it's a really informative and well-written book. I enjoyed the heck out of it. Hirschfeld, the thing to know about Hirschfeld is he lived 99 and a half years, and David worked with him from when Hirschfeld turned 86 on. And you can tell from the book, as well as this conversation that's coming, Al Hirschfeld lived his life to the fullest. And you could say maybe that's what helped him live as long as he did. I recently did interview a 93-year-old artist who felt that rage and good genetics were what kept him going. It's luck of the draw. The great thing is we got Al Hirschfeld's art for almost a century. And David does a wonderful job capturing it in the Hirschfeld Century and in all the work he's done on Al Hirschfeld's estate with the Al Hirschfeld Foundation, which we'll talk about during the show. Now, to do this episode, I drove down to Bedminster, Pennsylvania, to the studio of Ben Soloway, which is a farm where David and his family lives. Soloway was another great artist, who was David's grand uncle, and David administers the studio and the exhibition space that's on the grounds of this 34-acre farm. It is a wonderful location, and I'm thankful that we met there instead of, somewhere in New York City during one of David's trips. And in general, I'm just thankful. Thankful for the time that he gave me. I am thankful for Drew Friedman for bringing us together. I'm thankful for the connections that this show creates. It really means a lot to me that I get to do this and that people who've done this show think about who else would enjoy it and who they would love to hear me talk to. So here's David's bio. David Leopold is an author and curator who has organized exhibitions for institutions around the country, including the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, the Norman Rockwell Museum at Stockbridge, and the Field Museum in Chicago. Internationally, he's curated shows for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the film museums in Frankfurt and Berlin. He organized the archive of Al Hirschfeld's work for the artist, visiting Hirschfeld in his studio at least once a week for 13 years until the artist's death in 2003. David is now the creative director for the Al Hirschfeld Foundation. His latest book, The Hirschfeld Century, a portrait of the artist and his age, published by Alfred A. Knopf to coincide with a major retrospective that Leopold curated for the New York Historical Society, has won universal acclaim. The Washington Post called it an instant classic, and Amazon selected it for its top books of 2015. David's other books include David Levine's American Presidents, Fantagraphics, 2008, Irving Berlin's Show Business, Broadway, Hollywood, America, Abrams, 2005, listed as a top gift pick by the Boston Globe and New York Times, and Al Hirschfeld's Hollywood, Abrams, 2001. He also authored a number of monographs on underappreciated artists for various museums. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with David Leopold. Just tell me about your history initially with Al Hirschfeld. Where did it all begin? And
I started with Hirschfeld like everybody else, looking at his drawings in the New York Times on Sunday. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which you please don't hold against me. And the only time culture happened in Harrisburg was on Sunday when the Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer came, and we devoured the arts section. Now, the first thing I looked at in the arts section, in the arts and leisure, in the Times was, before I knew anything about the arts, we looked for the Hirschfeld drawings, and we looked for Nina's, and it was a couple of years before I was like, who are these drawings of? And in a way, it changed my life. And it was one of those things, it was an initiation, right? Just like everybody else has had. You sort of you're sort of initiated into this world of Broadway and Hollywood and music and all that. But my life went on. I didn't think about him anymore or any less than anybody else. And in 1989, I was doing research on a great uncle of mine, Ben Soloway, who did charcoal portraits from life of everybody on Broadway, opera, film, dance, for the New York Times and the Herald Tribune. And as I was going through these clippings, I decided to catalog them, see, what it is. We'd always known that was a part of his career, but what was it?
Yeah.
And so as I started to catalog it, I was looking at the clippings, and I could see that there was a Hirschfeld drawing next to it or on the back of it. And so one day I decided to look him up, and I wrote him. He was in the phone book.
Yeah.
And I got the nicest letter back I ever got from a stranger. And he invited me to come up to quaff some tea anytime I was in Fun City.
Quaff.
And I went up there and we hit it off. And I thought, I'm so patting myself on the back. I hit it off with Al Hirschfeld.
I managed to charm him.
You're right. It turns out really everybody hit it off with Al because he was this extremely nice guy. And then I got asked to organize the archives of his work. And he was 86 years old. I was 23. And I figured, well, that'll be like a 2-year job. I didn't really want to do it, but I just thought it was too good of an opportunity not to. I'd start going to a studio once or twice a week and just gathering what he had done, starting from scratch. He had a big jump on me. But I worked at it very diligently, and he was always working. I hold the record for the most free lunches at the home of Al Hirschfeld because what it ended up, instead of 2 years, it ended up being 13 years. Mm-hmm. And I put together the first retrospective exhibition of his work. I really dug in deep. He used to laugh when people used to interview him. He used to say, it's always the same 10 questions. And I thought it was hyperbole until I read a lot of the interviews, and it was the same 10 questions. And so we just got a chance to go deeper. And, because I was there for a long time, and we ended up sharing this vocabulary. What had happened is I started working down at this gallery that sold his work, and this is how I really got to know Al. My grandmother had died suddenly in Harrisburg just about a month or two after I started working with Al. I really didn't know him that well. Mm-hmm. And I go to Harrisburg. Of course, we're sitting Shiva. And although she was in her late 70s, she was a real matriarch, not only of the family, but of the community in Harrisburg. And her sudden death had really cast a pall over everything. The Shiva was not a social thing. People were pretty downcast, and it was very sad. And my second and fifth grade teacher show up. They're friends of the family, and they ask me what I'm doing, and I say this, that, and the other thing. And I said, I started working with Al Hirschfeld. Who's he? I said, caricature, Nina, theater. Nothing. Total blank. And I said, I know you've seen the work. Well, I was carrying around books of his work because I was supposed to be an expert on Hirschfeld. And of course, I didn't know anything else than anybody else did. So I brought down a book of his work. And of course, as soon as they saw it, they're like, I love this work. And let's look for the Ninas. Well, the book starts getting passed around and people are all of a sudden smiling and laughing and starting to tell stories. And it changed the whole character of what was going on. And I was really struck by this, like, wow, here's art really doing something. And when I got back to New York, I get to the gallery, and a messenger's going up to Al's. And just on a whim, I dash off a quick note and saying, I know you don't know me that well, and you certainly didn't know my grandmother, but this is what happened. And so thanks. You did something for my family that, even though you didn't know you did it, it meant a great deal to us, and thank you for that. And he called me up, and he's like, David, this is Al Hirschfeld. Tell me about your grandmother. And we started trading stories about our grandmothers and our mothers. And I said, let me ask you about this. And something happened that day, in that conversation. And after that, whenever I had a question, I was working in this gallery at first because we thought that was the best place to start. Sure. But then it just became, what I really needed to be was in the studio. And I was going to leave. And he's like, come work with me. And I said, fantastic. And so again, like I said, I was up there once or twice a week. I probably saw him more than most of my friends and certainly my family. But we had it was informal.
Yeah.
There were no titles. I gave him an invoice every once in a while. He never questioned it. It was just, we didn't have any set schedule. I knew that he was always going to be at his drawing table. I mean, right. That's what he wanted to do first and foremost. And he did it in good times and in bad times. So it was very easy for me.
What was his work day like? I mean, it seems as though he's, again, at the drawing table.
Almost every
I think
day.
You put in the Hirschfeld Century something like about 10 to 5 with a little break for lunch and tea. But
right.
How is that integrated with what he had to do in terms of going to Broadway shows or going to rehearsals and trying to get something that he could sketch, something that he can make a drawing out of? Like how I guess how much overtime is a way of putting it.
Well, for him, it was all, there was no...
Life was work and work was life?
Yes. Okay. He did what he did because that's who he was. Mm-hmm. He said that at a very young age, he contracted a sickness for drawing. And that's what he was. He was infected his entire life. And yes, he worked all day. And then when the sun went down, he worked in this little, these blue, it was like a jumpsuit. He looked like some gasoline attendant from a French gas station. That's all I can say. It struck me that way.
I think Seth wears something like that too, he'd said, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but when nighttime came, he would change his clothes, have a drink, and go out. I mean, every night of his life, or have people in, virtually every night of his life. And this is all the way to the end at 99 and a half. Now, when I knew him, Broadway was a much different animal than it was when he was starting. So when I knew him, he did most of his drawing, even his sketches, in his studio, because Broadway shows had changed to the point there weren't out-of-town tryouts where he usually went to do his drawings. And even though they were in town, which should have made it easier for him, producers were always very uptight about people from the press coming in to see a show that wasn't ready to be seen yet. And even though Broadway never had a better friend than Al Hirschfeld, they were concerned that he might say something to somebody, horses. He works for the Times. Maybe he'll say something. Although, I mean, here's a man who worked for the Times for 75 years, never had an office there, never went there. The first 2 years he worked there, nobody even knew what he looked like, because he would drop the drawings off with the doorman.
It's a funny moment from the book, I think, when you mentioned that in terms of him thinking he's unimportant to them and them all wondering, oh my God, when will we finally get to meet this artist?
The most mysterious man at the paper. Right. And of course, then when he does go down there, he meets George Kaufman, who's the editor of the drama section. And most importantly, he meets Brooks Atkinson, who... again, today it's hard for people to understand, but Brooks Atkinson was the major critic of the 14 daily newspapers that were in New York during really the golden age of Broadway, mid 20th century. And he didn't write reviews that were this play is good or bad or tell you the plot. He wrote really insightful reviews that placed shows in their context, and he would review the show quickly the night it opened, and then on Sunday he would go and do a longer sort of think piece. And he and Al went to a tremendous amount of theater together. Now Al went to even more than Atkinson, because Al would often see the shows out of town and then come to opening night because he was a first nighter. And it was then he really saw the show. When he was in out-of-town tryouts, he was so focused on capturing sort of the essence of the production. He often did not know what the production was about, which seems sort of counterintuitive. But he was looking for that telling gesture, that movement, that piece of costume that revealed the character much more, because his drawings are full of all this activity, yet they never tell you any of the plot.
Right.
Because that's not what that's not what it's about. It is visual journalism, of course. He was capturing what was going on stage, but he wasn't making a judgment, and it wasn't about telling you what happened. He was capturing the action of what was happening.
Did he have any relationship with Soloway? Your
they were acquaintances.
Okay.
I mean, Al wrote back this really warm letter to me about Ben Soloway, saying that, you know, he admired his work for years and that they knew each other only in passing, because Al was an artist who really spent a lot of time in the theater. And whereas Soloway was an artist who showed with Matisse, Picasso, de Kooning, Hopper, and did his theater work. I mean, they both, in their very early parts of their careers, they were both doing the theater work to pay the room rent, as Al would say. And for Al, it's just something that stuck.
Yeah, why do you think that is? I mean, there's historical reasons, I'm sure, but he starts out with, you know, being a quote unquote fine artist, painter, landscape.
Oh, it's in Al's case, it's very easy to understand.
Yeah.
Al was a painter. He'd had exhibitions in New York and Chicago and St. Louis and Paris. Museums had collected his work. And then he makes this trip to Bali in 1932. And this is after, you know, he was still painting, but he'd been working when he left New York, originally for Tahiti and ended up in Bali. When he left New York, he was working for 3 New York newspapers, 6 film studios, magazines, book covers. They hadn't invented the album cover yet, although he would become a master of that as well. So he had lots of work, but he had this real urge to paint and to be an easel painter. And it was that trip that changed his life. He goes to Bali. The sun is so bright there, it bleaches out all the color. And all he sees are black and white line drawings walking around. And he said his love affair with line, that's really when it began. If you look at his work, it's leading up to that. I mean, it takes that moment to be the decisive moment, because after that, he never paints again. And it's not because he didn't think he was any good. He just felt that what he really wanted to do was image in pure line. He really wanted to draw. And he was very fortunate that he was interested in making a great drawing. Who it was of was not as important to him as the drawing itself. And I think it's only now that we're really getting a chance to see that, because we get so caught up in the personalities of the performers. And anybody sort of over the age of 35, when they look at his work, I think they say, oh, she was great. And Katharine Hepburn, I loved her in this, and this, and Carol Channing or Zero Mostel or the Marx Brothers. We bring a whole history with us to these things. But younger audiences today don't have that history. They look at it like we look at Lautrec's drawings of Jane Avril, where I'm sure they were very accurate. I'm sure people at that time thought he really captured her. Yeah. And yet we don't look at them for the documentary nature now. We look at them for the aesthetic value. And Al, that's what Al was trying to do. He was trying to make a drawing that he said stood on its own 2 feet. And so it's that trip to Bali that sort of is the break of leaving behind sort of someone else's language and creating his own.
And how much of that do you think was the parameters of working largely in newsprint? What did it mean for what he was doing in terms of developing that visual language, knowing that everything he was doing was getting reproduced at a time that newspaper printing was not, you know.
Sure. Well,
fantastic.
He understood what you could do on newspaper print, but you have to understand, we think of him as a New York Times artist. Yeah. And there's a good reason for that, because on average, he was in the paper every other week for 75 years. Yet that represents less than half of his work. Mm-hmm. And while at the same time he's doing his formative newspaper work, which is reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, he's doing movie posters. Right. That is a much different medium and allows him to experiment a great deal more with color and texture, because it's beautiful stone lithography. I mean, he has the benefit of the sort of greatest printing press of the time. Mm-hmm. And so while newspaper reproduction is pretty crude, and his style was perfect for that, it turned out it was perfect for everything else as well. And will continue to be, because when we got into a digital world, you could fax a Hirschfeld drawing and it would still look great.
Right.
And that was a testament to the drawing rather than the reproduction process. His drawings always look good on the page, in a newspaper page. And newspaper print, as we know, is the cheapest paper known to mankind. Most people's toilet paper is nicer than newsprint, or at least newsprint of that time. Yeah. And so his style was not predicated on that, but he exploited, his style for drawing in newspapers, for instance. What he knew that early in his career he couldn't do a really thick line the way that he wanted to because it didn't work out well. And as newspaper reproduction got better, it allowed him more freedom to do other things. But for a long time, he was just constrained by the limitations. And in his early work, he tried to make the drawings the same size as they would appear in the newspaper because he thought, well, that'll get me the best fidelity. And then he realized that's really the engraver's art. That's not his art. And he started to work on a much larger board. Most of his drawings for practically 40 or 50 years of his career were on boards that were 20 by 30 inches on, generally, and much, much bigger because he was doing something that would work in the newspaper, but also would work for him as an artist.
When you were archiving and indexing all this work, was there a fixation with any particular performing artist that befuddled you? Or did they simply make sense in terms of, well, this guy was popular at this time of his career, therefore it makes sense that Al would draw him or her repeatedly? Or was there somebody who was a sort of muse that you just don't get? In terms of
there were people that he drew a lot.
Yeah.
For instance, the Marx Brothers. He knew he was getting good in 1935 when they started to look like his drawings rather than the other way around. Yeah. And that sounds like a line, but it was very true. I mean, literally, the Marx Brothers, the costume department at MGM, for their second film for MGM, he had done all the posters for Night at the Opera, as well as trade ads. And I mean, there was just such a plethora of things that you could do drawings for. For their second film, the costume department tried to get Groucho's hair to be these two triangles of hair like Hirschfeld had given him. And so, but it really was something. He had captured the character of them. Laurel and Hardy, he did all the posters for their first 8 films at MGM. They signed on to MGM around the same time he started working for the studio. And so much of what we think of Laurel and Hardy is as much a part of Hirschfeld as it is Laurel and Hardy. He saw them graphically. He said to me one time, he said they always look like the number 10 to him. And so all their great posters, and when I say posters, they did at least 6 different posters for a film. 1 sheet, which is your standard size, 3 sheet, 6 sheet, all the way up to 24 sheets. So Al, at 25 years old, while his friends were trying to get into the smartest magazines and museums and everything like that, Al could go into Times Square and go to the Astor Theater in Times Square and see his drawings sometimes 3 to 8 stories tall.
Yeah, Lorenzo Matodi talked about that in a different way. When he started doing fashion illustration, because he was this revolutionary artist working on these cartoons that no one was reading, and then gets commissioned to do something in Italian Vogue and realized 5 million people just saw my drawing. That's a little bit better than me and my little revolutionary cadre over here, and started a second career for him.
Well, for Al, it fit into, I think, also his sort of small d democratic ideals. Mm-hmm. It was art for everyone. He liked that aspect of it. He was not picky about where his drawings appeared. He just wanted them to look good when they appeared. And he knew that he had more control over that than anybody. If it could look good on newsprint, he was pretty safe almost everywhere else.
Yeah, you mentioned the democratic ideal. Where did he fall politically? Given that he's part of the theater world, which is very left at that
and he was. As a young man, he really thought that communism was going to be the salvation of the world. And in fact, when he got his first marriage in 1928, he and his wife, he married a showgirl for Earl Cowell's Vanities.
As one does.
Yes. Totally different than Al. And I asked him one time, I said, Flo, her name was Flo Allen, why did you marry her? And he said, because everyone told me not to. Which was Al to a T. And so where did they go? They go to spend 5 months in Moscow in 1928. And Al gets made an international correspondent from the Herald Tribune. And there was nothing at that time that made him think that communism was not going to be the salvation of the world. And yet when he returned in 1936 for a Russian theater festival, he convinced Brooks Atkinson to go. He was appalled at how as he said, everyone, all the officials look like Saul Steinberg drawings with all these medals across their chest and everything, and that they were still doing the same shows they had been doing 8 years earlier, and they weren't better. In fact, they were stale. And that the environment of the whole country seemed so different. He felt that politics was something you get involved with as a young man. He did lots of drawings for New Masses and Ken and all kinds of political magazines. But after a drawing he did for the New Masses in 1939 of Father Conklin, didn't run because the New Masses editors said it would offend Catholic Unionists. They came up to a contingent came up to Al's studio to convince him why they shouldn't run this drawing. And Al, of course, said, "Well, aren't you the guys who say there is no God?" And he said they had a discussion the whole night long. He said all he got out of it were a couple of pipe burns on his sofa. And after that, he realized he was closer to Groucho Marx than he was to Karl Marx. And then, within 10 years, 8 years really, he has a phenomenal success with a book that he did with S.J. Perlman called Westward Ha, or Around the World in 80 Cliches. And he decided capitalism couldn't be all bad because any system where he could make money, couldn't be all bad. Right. But he supported liberal causes. He was a liberal through and through. Very old school.
Do you feel he had any road less traveled in terms of a direction he would have wanted to take with his art? That his career seems awfully fulfilling from the outside, but do you feel that he had any sort of, if only I had done this instead?
I don't think so. I asked him one time, I said, is there a project you want to do that you've never been able to do? And he said in the 1950s he wanted to illustrate a Alice in Wonderland with a black girl as Alice. And he took it to Knopf, of all things. And the editor there dismissed it as completely a terrible idea, that nobody would want that. And I asked him, I said, well, do you want to do that now? He says, well, it wouldn't be anything now. Right. He was surprisingly very satisfied as an artist in the sense of, he had this wonderful exhibition space every other week in the Times. It was literally reaching millions of people. And maybe it was the TV guide covers that you saw. I mean, he did more TV guide covers than any other artist, or record albums. I mean, there's just legion of them. Books, playbill covers. I mean, his work was being seen. He was, and most importantly to him, he was getting assignments all the time. He didn't really draw for himself. I mean, every drawing was for himself, but he didn't have to spend his time thinking about what should I draw, because someone always said, would you draw this? We'll pay you to draw that. And for Al, that was fine. He was going to follow his own muse. Was there any private work of his or sketchbook work that was, outside of the purviews of work that you came across? Well, the sketchbooks were full of course, all of his own drawings. Yeah. But, Al was the kind of individual that he'd go out to dinner with somebody, and as the night wore on, he would, if he got bored or not bored, I don't know, he would start drawing. I've been to people's houses where they have napkins and under frames that have Hirschfeld drawings. So Louise Hirschfeld told me a story. One night they're out with Woody Allen, and they're at Daniel. And Al starts sketching on the tablecloth, and it comes to the end of the meal, and Woody Allen says he'd like to take the drawings on the table of Woody Allen and his wife, and Daniel, the chef, comes out and says no, he wants it. And they start getting into an argument about it. And Louise said to Al, let's go. Let's get out of here before it gets, ugly. And I said, well, would you know what happened? She says, while we were getting into our car, we saw Woody come out with the tablecloth over his arm. So and running. Did he have many relationships with, we'll say, the performing artists first, and then I'm wondering about other visual artists also? Well, both. Yeah. Al was he's such a theater goer and was a people person, and he is one of those sort of ghosts of the machine of so much. He not only knew really everybody in the theater and the film world, because remember, he was not a peripheral player. He was literally in the center of it for his entire life. He's working for MGM. Well, he's not working for some outpost. He's working in working for the New York office. Yeah. The performers that would come up most of them came from the theater who he had drawn before. And of course, they look forward to having their drawings done. I mean, although in the beginning, Al said he used to get complaints and then he started getting accolades and it was still the same drawings. So, of course, there really wasn't anybody in the performing arts. And when I say performing arts, I mean theater, film, television, music. He had because he went out all the time.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's what I'm wondering. Socially,
socially friends with everybody.
Yeah.
And then in the visual arts, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. So whether they were artists you've never heard of, or Salvador Dali or Mark Rothko. I mean, Rothko, one of his last nights on the planet is spent with Al Hirschfeld. They were neighbors. And Rothko told him that the inspiration for his art came from when he was, Al told me this, when he was a soda jerk in Harvard. And one day he saw the ice cream melting. And he said, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to capture and paint. And Al was very helpful to the family after he died because there was a lot of shenanigans with Marlboro Gallery and things like that, and Al tried to sort of navigate that through. It's Al that Billy Rose was a good friend of his, and when Billy was getting older and was thinking, how am I going to leave my mark, he wanted to buy Ellis Island, which wasn't in use at that time, and make it a retirement home for millionaires. And Al convinced him that maybe wasn't such a great idea, but, he loved the theater so much, maybe he could help out the library in collecting things for the theater. And that's why we have the Billy Rose Theater Collection. One of the reasons.
Was there any sense of rivalry with any other artists or I hate saying caricaturist because that's not what he did.
Well, I don't think there was.
Was there anybody who had a bad word, in that space?
Well, there was I one time saw last year, about a year ago, I saw Drew Friedman and Stephen Kroeninger do a wonderful evening of forgotten characterists. And unfortunately, these are the characterists who happen to be alive and well and working in the age of Hirschfeld. And unfortunately, although Al came up during a vogue for caricature, within 10 years, he was it. When you talk caricature in America, you were talking about Hirschfeld, and then there was everybody else. And if Hirschfeld wasn't available, other people got the work.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there was a lot of artists who stuck pins into their own Hirschfeld voodoo doll. But please don't let anybody who believes in voodoo take offense, but it didn't work with him. And so, I mean, he told me a story one night. He was friends with Gian Milli, the photographer, and they got talking. It was at a party, and Al and his friends would say provocative things to get a conversation going, to get people riled up, because they liked that. Yeah. I mean, they liked it. And so he was telling the photographer that, it's not that hard to take a good photograph. And of course, Millie had a different feeling and challenged Al to, let's see who takes a better photograph. And they go down to Millie's studio, and so who do they bring with them? They bring some friends from the party, Clifford Odets and set designer Boris Aronson and Don Freeman, who was also there. I mean, there was just a bunch of people. And they go down there, and Gian Milli takes his picture first. And, of course, it's a great photograph. And Al arranges with Boris Aronson that he's going to take a picture of Clifford Odets, but at the signal, he's to break a plate on the back of Odette's head, for a reaction. Yeah. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And I said, well, what did Millie say? He said, Millie said that the film didn't develop, So, I mean, they were friends. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were friends. But so Hal was unusual in the sense that although, I mean, for lack of a better word, he was a caricaturist, and by nature, everybody should have hated him for making them look terrible. The fact is, everyone loved him, and he drew the vainest people in the world, and they all look forward to the next drawing. And it was like that way with his friends. Everybody enjoyed his company. I really don't think there's anybody who ever came away and said, Al's so dull, or he wouldn't be a good asset to a party. I think it's one of the reasons he got so much work, because he was a great guy to have around. He was a great raconteur. He was very insightful, and so he was whether you were in a rehearsal or on the set of a film or at a party, Al was an asset.
How do you think his work changed over at least in the 13 years that you were working with him, if not from the early days on, as you've chronicled or indexed all of his?
Of course it changes, and it took me a whole book to sort of discuss those changes. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, he's an artist who discovers what he wants to do very early on, and then works at it his whole life and just gets better and better at it. I think it's sort of like a poet who figures out what's the best word to put in. Maybe his early poems are very wordy and free verse and everything, and by the end he's being able to say it in 3 lines and iambic pentameter or something like that. And that was Al. He was constantly, he didn't want to use less lines because he was some sort of minimalist. He just wanted every line to count, and to mean something. And so he kept working at that. It was a graphic question that he made up and he solved to his own satisfaction. So what I saw in the years that I was with him and looking through his whole work was just figuring out how to keep saying that better and in a fresh way. Because one of the downsides of ubiquity, because he was everywhere, everyone has a personal relationship with Al because they saw his work all the time. Right. But one of the downsides to that is you can't keep doing the same thing. Otherwise, people say, "Oh, it's another one of those," yeah. Or it would have been very period. Al's work is very timeless. We look at drawings from the 40s now, and they look like they were drawn yesterday, or perhaps they could be drawn tomorrow. His work is the only way you could really tell when it was drawn was usually by the grooming choices or the clothing choices made by the subjects. Of course, I can tell. I think anybody who really looks at his work can say, "Oh, this is a Hirschfeld work from the 30s or the 60s or something." I mean, there are things that the line gets thicker in the 60s. He's able to do more with it because of that, because of newspaper reproduction and just printing processes altogether. But he's constantly exploring and not only exploring his medium, but reinventing himself. Because you couldn't keep doing the same thing, and consequently, it always remained fresh.
When you talk about the timelessness, it's one of the things that struck me, and I was showing pictures from the Hirschfeld century to my wife, just like, you don't get this exactly, but this could be done from like 1965 or 50 years later. I think, in particular, I showed her the Man from La Mancha one with this incredible loose line. And then the absolute solidity of the armor done in this incredible cross hatching. I'm like, but he was doing this a couple days a week. He was just knocking out one after another like that. Do you see any successor in any way, or are there younger caricatures? You mentioned Drew and Stephen,
who are geniuses. I mean, I just think they're so good. I don't think there was anybody like Hirschfeld before Hirschfeld, mm-hmm. and I don't think there was anybody. There's anybody like him today. There's a lot of art. There's a number of artists who tried to emulate his style while he was working, and still do today. But there is nobody as sui generis as Hirschfeld, where you can really look at the line and just to see a part of a line and say, "Oh, well, of course it's Hirschfeld."
And is that genius?
That I think it is, and although that was sort of a dirty word in the Hirschfeld home studio, Al was a guy. He was he was unimpressed with himself. To talk about himself was a chore. To talk about almost anything else was a pleasure. And he wasn't doing it because you or I liked it. He was doing it because he liked it, and he felt very fortunate that he understood what editors wanted. But that didn't dictate solely what he was going to do. He just used that as sort of the leaping off point.
And that you mentioned that not wanting to talk about himself. He did very little in terms of, we'll say, autobiography. of I think you mentioned in the Hirschfeld Century introduction he does to a work that provides a little
25-page piece in the World of Hirschfeld.
But really doesn't care to look back at his life.
Oh, he was not a navel gazer by any stretch of the imagination, and he had zero interest in the past. Mm-hmm. I mean, for a man who had an incredible history, I think I tell a story in the book. A friend of his came up, a longtime press agent, longtime friend, came up one day. I was in the studio, and Al was in the studio, and Al's drawing, and I'm doing what I'm doing. This guy comes up, and for an hour, he spends time talking with Al while Al's drawing because
he doesn't stop.
He never stops. And they're laughing and talking about these things, and this guy's telling all these wonderful stories. And the guy leaves, and Al, in all sincerity, he was not a dumb man by any stretch of the imagination. He turns to me and says, I don't get these guys. They always like to talk about the past. And it was clear that it didn't factor into his life at all. Mm-hmm. Because every day he was faced with a whiteboard that could care less about what he had accomplished. That it was only going to care about what he did today. And that kept him completely, I think, in the moment. And I think it was who he was as an individual, and maybe a life lesson for all of us. That he was, long before Be Here Now, Al was already there.
And I think he benefits from outliving everyone else who would have, been able to be a source if they were going to write about him. So
right. Well, he had plenty of people write about him. I mean, he gave thousands of interviews in his life, had wonderful people write nice long pieces about him. But again, oftentimes it devolves into talking about Carol Channing or the Marx Brothers or people that he had drawn. Or, of course, they want to talk about Nina. Yeah. And he answers them all gamely, but Hal was not one of those people or artists that had moments of doubt. He knew what he was about, and he knew what he was trying to get. Even if he wasn't entirely sure how he was going to get there, he sort of knew where he was going. And so he did not suffer indecisiveness. He was very clear on what he was doing.
Yeah, how much of his career do you feel was, I don't want to say a product of his time, so much as permitted by the times in which he existed? And the times is a pun in this case. But, I mean, he had that talent, but also there had to be the ecosystem of those major media evolving at that time, the entertainment industry that needed this sense of publicity and promotion. Where does he fit in that matrix?
Well, he was very, very fortunate.
And how much has he helped feed that matrix?
Well, he was the perfect artist for the period. When he's working for, like I said, we think of him as a New York Times person. Well, in the first 15 years of his career, he was a newspaper artist more than just particularly with the Times, because he was in the Times, the Herald Tribune, and the Brooklyn Sunday Eagle. Now, there were 14 daily newspapers in New York, so that gave you plenty of opportunity to get work. It was the golden age of magazines, really of publishing altogether. So there was just literally hundreds of places to do drawings for, and until really sort of mid-century, maybe the 1960s, drawing was considered they did that much more than photographs. Right. It was easier to reproduce a drawing than it was to reproduce a photograph. And people liked that. They had come from this literally centuries old tradition of drawings and as illustrations. Now Al's work, again for the newspapers, wasn't really illustration in the traditional sense. It didn't illustrate articles. That these were standalone features. So they were something unto themselves. So he was very, very fortunate that there were all these places that he could work. And film studios. I mean, he grew up in an age where film was the internet of its time. It was the new media of its time. But of course, how do you promote it? You promote it by the way you promoted everything, which was through print. Yeah. And so there was just... even within the ecosystem of a film studio, not only do you have these multiple posters and you had heralds that you gave out and black and white art that would be kept, they would send out these exploitation brochures to the theater owners that would have Hirschfeld drawings you could send into your local paper, along with reviews and quote interviews with the stars and everything, or contests that you could run. But they also had these incredibly lavish trade publications that they sent to the theater owners that were just in the industry altogether. And Al did some incredible work for that. The people always want to know who he drew the most. Julie Andrews is the answer. And one of the reasons he drew Julie Andrews the most was because in 1969, she made a film you've never heard of, which was supposed to be the biggest thing ever, and it turned out to be a huge flop. It was called Star. It was this fictionalized biography of Gertrude Lawrence. And she played this bitchy music hall star, no coward and all these things. And the world wasn't ready for Mary Poppins or Maria von Trapp to be a bitchy music hall star. And of course, in 1969, the Hollywood musical was literally on its deathbed, and it was like 35 years earlier when people approached the box office and said, "Is it a musical?" Because if it was a musical, they didn't want to go. So Al did 39 drawings for this film. More than 2/3 of them featured Julie Andrews in some way, shape, or form. So who would do that today? I mean, there isn't anything. Movie publicity today is you get a logo. That's right. What you get. Nobody, and of course, there's all these wonderful books and art that goes with it. But today, a movie poster's a logo. I mean, the great movie poster is done in by agents and lawyers who insist on their client getting a certain size, font size of their name on the poster.
Yeah, tell me about you and your history with pop culture. Because again,
I'm a consumer.
Yeah, but there's a degree of aficionado. I think I don't know how much of that is related to the occupation versus how much drove you into the field to begin with.
Well, I always tell people I don't collect art. I collect artists, I've had the great fortune of not only working with Hirschfeld and David Levine. I've done some work with Jules Pfeiffer, Tony Auth, this wonderful editorial cartoonist at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a lot of artists you've never heard of. And artists that you have heard of, like Jan and Stan Berenstain of the Berenstain Bears. Yeah. I mean, just a whole other world and fascinating in its own right. That's what interests me. And then this past
actually, go back. What is it that interests you? The process by which they work, the whole model in which they build a career,
the characters, and how. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate that my collection is really blue chip. When you talk about Hirschfeld and Levine, you're not going to get greater caricatures of the 20th century, and through them, I saw everybody of importance in caricature, and they both were these interesting guys, completely different than one another, but really interesting guys. And I've always been interested in the art more than necessarily the subject matter. And I have a visual memory. And, with Al, we had this vocabulary that he and I shared about his art. I could reference a drawing from 1933. Or he could, and both of us would right away know what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. Or he might say, "Oh, I did something like this," and I would know exactly what he was talking about. And it was fascinating, and unfortunately, I don't have that. I work with a wonderful woman, Catherine Eastman, who is pretty good at it. When we do these, we go around giving talks they're improvised, illustrated talks, where I'll just talk about anything, and she knows the work well enough now that she can put up the right image. And she's the closest I've come to having somebody I can really have that same sort of vocabulary with. But like with the Berensteins, I met them by chance. I actually wanted their work for an exhibition that I was asked to put together, which I never got, by the way. But we started this conversation that ended up with me putting together the first retrospective of their work that traveled around. And I was interested because their work was richer than I had originally given it credit for. And we think children's books, particularly those ones done by, under Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss, they seem so simple. And yet there's a real magic to how that gets done, how it makes you want to turn the page, how the words just have to be just right in some way. It's like that poetry analogy I'd made before. It's figuring out just the right combination of words and pictures to move the book along. And they were geniuses at that. I mean, they literally were geniuses. And look, I love obscure. Who doesn't among us love things that are appreciated by almost nobody? You know, we have those special things.
You're on a show like that right now.
Yeah, right. But, you know, if you want a good review, that's wonderful. You want to sell books. And they sold 250 million books. So obviously they connected with people. And it's so easy to sort of say it's not important. But the fact is, when the day comes, no one's going to remember Jennifer Bartlett, you know, for instance, as a contemporary artist, in the way that they're going to remember the Berensteins because they grew up with them. Right. You know, they were literally part of their lives. And this work that was done for publication, what for years has been called illustration, turns out to have a much bigger effect on people than any of the fine arts that was done during that period. And of course, a lot of those artists were influenced by the sort of traditional easel artists, the studio artists. But you know, to a great extent, it's their work that remains with people rather than work that you see in museums.
And growing up, I mean, you mentioned having Hirschfeld, you know, as a kid when you're growing up. But were there other artists when you were developing, you know, getting into college, et cetera? Well,
the artist that had the biggest effect on me, this is going to sound strange, is the Grateful Dead. I grew up in a world in which I got turned on to them in about the 10th grade, and it was a real eye-opening. It was a trip. The idea of collective improvisation every night in a sort of very big scale was fascinating to me. I loved the music, and taking chances just seemed to me like, right, that's the way to do it. Now that was a band that did not have commercial success for almost their entire career, and yet they were filling football stadiums. Right. Now, their biggest problem is they were too popular. They took a break in the mid 70s because they were just playing too big of places, and they wanted to play smaller places. I mean, who does that? And so, as a arts paradigm, they were really very crucial in my development because it sort of gave me that open mind, that sort of improvisational idea connected to art, which we tend to think of as jazz, you know, which does play a role. But what I liked about it, and what I saw was connected to the theater, was this sort of collective situation rather than the individual artist situation. And that always interests me. Now, as fate would have it, my worlds collided this summer. I did this show at this past summer at the New York Historical Society. I did the Hirschfeld Century, and it was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest show in New York this summer. And it wasn't the biggest show that I did. I did for a week before that show opened, I got a call from the Grateful Dead archive, and they asked me, would I put together a show on the Grateful Dead for their final shows in Chicago, July 4th.
Yeah.
And I said, could you have waited a few more weeks?
Exactly right at that moment. But you realize when you're coming from the Grateful Dead, long range planning might not really be
right. Well, they did, but it was one of those things that those shows particularly were one of those things that I don't think anybody understood what was going to happen and what it was going to be like. And we ended up putting together this show in 6 weeks. That turned out to be fantastically popular and I think quite good. I mean, it's and so for me, it was exactly that improvisational sort of energy. And when it's really working, it's very exciting.
What sort of material went into the Dead thing?
Well,
I'm envisioning his album art and things like that.
Well, I decided that was the story that everybody knew.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell the story between the Dead and Deadheads, because they were essentially, their audience, they were their audience. That's how it all started. And they never really lost touch with that. And when they started when their audience started to communicate with them and back and forth, they worked it out. They wanted to take care of their audience, and not in a way like, wow, because we can market to them, but because they were their sort of fellow travelers. And so I told the story from very early on. from the 60s when, the acid test is a communal event. Where it wasn't that the Grateful Dead were playing at the acid test. You were going to the acid test, and the Grateful Dead might play. If they had their act together, they would play. And then in the early 70s, they don't start. I mean, a lot of these artists have their own record labels. The Dead had their own record company. They completely went outside the system, and how they communicated with their audience in order to do that and to make it successful is a story unto itself. Later on, they. Again, they were the internet before there was an internet.
Well, putting out their own bootlegs is certainly,
Well, but allowing people to make their own.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
They by 1984, they designate a part of the venue as a taper section. Mm-hmm. And, the whole record industry is geared to make sure that doesn't happen. And here it was, not only were they letting it happen, they were sort of almost encouraging it. And, of course, it was the best marketing they could have ever done. It was probably the single biggest thing that they did to sort of spread their name. They also help. So much of the modern concert experience today is a product of the Grateful Dead. When you buy a T-shirt at a concert, the Grateful Dead did that. The sound that you hear at most concerts was developed to a large extent by the Grateful Dead. The people who did the Grateful Dead are the people who went out and started other companies and do it today. Lighting, same thing. The first people to use computers with lighting, it's Grateful Dead. So much of that, and that was because they wanted the best for themselves and for their audience. And so that's the story I told.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw a parallel between them and Hirschfeld. First, I can envision, Al saying, David, why don't you put on some music while we're working? And I don't really see that happening.
No.
But the idea that they were almost constantly touring,
yes,
puts me. Seems to be a parallel with Hirschfeld just never really taking a break from the work.
One of the things I didn't do in my life that I could have had done and I didn't do, and I kick myself every once in a while. I could have had Jerry Garcia meet Al Hirschfeld. I had fallen in with the Grateful Dead, and after a couple of years, although a lot of people try to get backstage, I never was that person, and yet they found me. I have a twin brother. And when they were on their 20th anniversary,
it was him and they,
between the two of us, we ended up. I forget how we first met. Just through a weird series of circumstances, we met their publicist. And when they had their 20th anniversary, we were the same age, and he wanted young, articulate deadheads, and we were it. And so I got interviewed by Time magazine and the Today Show, all these things. And one of the benefits that came with that is, sometimes get backstage passes. I met most of the band, but I've literally never had any interest in them as individuals. Sure, I'd like to spend an evening with a member of the Grateful Dead talking and whatever, but short of that, no, I'll just go out and listen to the music. That's really all I care about. I couldn't tell you what their favorite colors are. None of those things interest me. But I thought, God, in the early 90s, I knew both sides of that equation, and they would have loved each other because they would have seen very much. Jerry Garcia, Al Hirschfeld were two guys with at that point white beards, who were who liked characters, who enjoyed the same kinds of things even if they did it in a different way. They were real life lovers, and I knew that Jerry Garcia liked Django Reinhardt. Well, I knew that Hirschfeld had helped Django get his first recording date. There would be these kind of connections that, and I knew that as artists, Garcia was something of a visual artist. So he would get it too. Closest I ever got to it was when Garcia died. There was this great sort of got to do something, and I suggested that he to his gallery that they should do an edition of prints of Jerry Garcia. They should get Hirschfeld to draw Jerry Garcia, and so I went up to Hirschfeld's studio with pictures of Garcia and tried to explain him to Jerry to Hirschfeld. Yeah. And he did a great drawing. Turned out to be the fastest selling print of all time.
And it's in the book.
It's in the book. Yeah. And then he did this drawing of the whole Grateful Dead, which I knew was successful because Phil Lesh, the bass player of the Grateful Dead, when he did his autobiography, he wanted that to be the end papers. And so when I did the show in Chicago at the Field Museum of all places, this really wonderful, natural history museum that was right across the street from the concert. Yeah. We made these huge banners, and one of them was because the Hirschfeld drawing was the only drawing that included all the members of the Grateful Dead. And people loved it because so many people, there's a huge, there's the Grateful Dead belt, which is essentially the Northeast. And all those people, of course, Hirschfeld, to them, they knew as much as Grateful Dead. So they came out and saw it and was like, oh, of course, So I love when the worlds mix. And then I come out here. I lived in Bucks County on a farm.
I wasn't going to say anything, but it's sort of a stereotypical, Grateful Dead thing, right?
Yeah.
Being out on a farm.
Yes, there are those, but I didn't pick it for that reason. It sort of picked me. But out here, I'm considered a complete freak. My neighbors, who were all wonderful, we're 90 minutes from the west side of Manhattan. Most of them have never gone. And the idea of going to it would be like going to Mars.
I did see a guy in a cowboy hat walking into church while I was driving down here this morning.
The Guns and God people, they live here. Yeah. And they're all wonderful. And I'm a Democratic committee person in a place that is like 75% Republican. Mm-hmm. But the great thing is when a tree falls and it needs to be cut up and moved away, everybody pitches in. I mean, it's what I love about sort of being outside and whatnot. It's a great equalizer. And so I can do all these things and come home and be amongst the greenery, and I love it.
Yeah. How did you end up here? And can we talk a little about the Ben Soloway Museum?
Sure. My life is all serendipity. Mm-hmm. I'd like to say that I've planned it out to the last fairly well, but it's be totally not true.
I had career by attrition for the longest time. that worked pretty well too. People kept
I guess you could say that. My Ben Soloway was a great uncle. And his wife was my grandmother's sister. And when I would go to the Spectrum to see the Grateful Dead or somebody else, we'd always come out and see Ray because she was fantastic. The art was really wonderful. The studio was intact, and she was a great storyteller. And I loved spending time with her. And after I got out of college, I stopped here I came out to this area for something completely different that got canceled, and people said, what do we do? And I said, let's go over and visit my Aunt Ray. And it turned out to be the best thing. I mean, it's something that would literally change my life. Because as we were here, she needed some work done, and I offered to come back out the following week and get that work done. And so I did that, and she needed something else. And so I started coming out on weekends. And because I'm in a world in which I'm not going to an office every day, I was just starting out my career. I had more time. So my time here would get longer and longer. And my family, particularly my grandmother, her sister, they were worried about Ray being out in the middle of nowhere. And what if she fell? And I said, well, I'm actually spend all my time in the studio. And she spends all of her time down at the house. So she's going to be laying there still for a while. Yeah. But they still wanted me to come out. And one day they came to me, Ray and another sister of hers, not my grandmother, came to me and asked me to take over the place. And although I was quite young, and my goal was to run like a small theater in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And I said, well, no, this isn't for me, but we'll find somebody. And I spent a year trying to get somebody in the family, literally trying to give a 34-acre farm away full of great art. And it was strange. Nobody wanted it. It was before the internet, you were out in the middle of nowhere here. And after a year, we approached the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and they loved Ben, but they just saw it as something they couldn't handle. I mean, if we offered it to them now, they'd be all over us. Sure. But that deal's no longer valid. That offer's no longer valid. So they came back to me and said, would I try it? And so she died in 1990. And she wanted the studio preserved for future generations to enjoy. And nobody was really sure what that really meant. And she didn't want to dictate what that was going to be because she wasn't going to be here to do the work. And so in '92, we had our first exhibition, and this is the best situation to work in. Everybody was supportive, family-wise, and, friends and patrons and whatnot. They were all supportive, and to a person, they all thought that nobody would come out here to see the show, or if they came out once, they'd never come out again. Right. And, well, that was a great place to start because you couldn't fail, You could just confirm what they thought.
That's the other thing, the career of low expectations.
Yes.
You and I have a lot in common, David.
Yes,
I gotta be honest.
Well, we started putting on exhibitions here. In the first year, although they told me the Philadelphia Inquirer would never come out and review this, and if they did, they would hate it. Turns out their lead critic came out here and fell in love with the place, and wrote what I can only say was a Valentine about the studio, and it brought hundreds of people out here. And from that, we built an audience. The Inquirer would regularly review us. Again, this idea that there were so many. It wasn't that there were so many publications at the time, but the few publications that did exist, everybody read.
Yeah.
So whereas now there are many more places, but it's so diffuse. So when you got a great review in the Philadelphia Inquirer or the New York Times, that was the making of somebody, and it was a huge help. Now there's no one place that you could be in, and all of a sudden everyone would say, yes, I've got to get there, because we don't all read the same things.
Yeah, now everything's much more, you need to generate buzz in 10,000 different
right,
venues.
and on so many different platforms. So I was very fortunate in that regard. And so what we do here is we put together interpretive exhibitions of his work and his contemporaries, and every once in a while a contemporary artist. We do it once or twice a year. We have it in his studio. The studio feels very much like it was when he was working, not because we kept everything in the same place, which is typical of most historic artist studios. They're mausoleums. Everything is dusty because they've kept it in the same place for decades. Right. Here, we move everything around just like the artist did. And so it feels very fresh. And one time, this critic from the Philadelphia Inquirer said, well, I just don't know where you're going to keep on coming up with ideas. Well, I've been doing it for 23 years, and let me tell you, I got another 23 years worth of ideas. And we can always start redoing the ones we did earlier because, we've been doing it that long, and we have, so our audience is totally unlike anything else because this is a destination. It's in the middle of a 34-acre farm. Our openings are usually on Saturday afternoons, and we open up the house and we fill it with home-baked cookies and cakes and things like that. The house is full of furniture that Ben made. He was a real Renaissance man. And so they see the show here, they go down there. I'll give a sort of what I call the poor man's audio tour, where you walk around and I just talk to you. But
it's artisanal, please.
Yes. And somehow there's an audience that just keeps coming back that supports the studio because we're not a nonprofit. It's a small family thing that we do, and it's supported by the way the studio was always supported through the sales of artwork and licensing and things like that. And somehow it works. And I'm not exactly sure how it is, and I don't want to investigate it too much because we've kept the character of what this place has been since 1936, and here it is 2016, and how many things can you say? In 80 years, again, it doesn't feel like you're walking into a mausoleum. It's still the Ben Soloway studio, and it's still full of wonderful artwork that you can see and learn something about. So it's a unusual situation that I love because I work with a lot of institutions. I pretty much work as a independent curator for museums across the country, and they're all wonderful. I have great long-term relationships, places I've never worked at, I enjoy working at. But I come back here and I really don't have the bureaucracy that I have to deal with. Sure. It's much more intuitive. And it's great. I love that.
And besides the Broadway drawings, what else characterizes Soloway's work?
Oh, well, he was a representational artist. Rich, lush painting. He didn't do, most artists are what my aunt used to call cookie cutter artists. They figure out and I'm not talking about the Matisse and the Picassos, but most artists discover something that people like and that they can sell. and they just keep painting that. Well, Ben Soloway wasn't that type of artist. He was a great portrait artist. It's what he did for the newspapers, so it was a natural outgrowth. If he had done nothing besides that, we'd know him as the John Singer Sargent of his day. His work hangs in the National Gallery and the Philadelphia Museum of Art and New York Public Library, all those places. But he was a great still life painter. He was a great fit. He came out of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, so he has this great figurative tradition. Landscapes, he felt that every time he looked out the window here, he saw a different landscape to paint, and they're highly collectible. He was great at drawing and painting. So our audience is actually about 5 or 6 different audiences who sometimes like one thing or another thing, and they come out here and they get exposed to that other thing, and they end up loving that too. At the same time, he created this whole studio. I mean, it was a barn, obviously, at one time, but today it looks like a 19th century French artist studio. He did all the woodwork, all the plasterwork, all the plumbing, all the electricity, not because he couldn't hire people, but because it's something he liked doing. He lived on Fifth Avenue and 12th Street. It's a new school now. But he had a wonderful studio there. He lived across the street from Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Ford Maddox Ford lived downstairs. Asher Gorky lived up the street. These were all people in their everyday life. And they gave up. And you look at his phone book from New York, it not only has all these visual artists, but it has all the theater people. So Marlene Dietrich or George Kaufman's or Katharine Hepburn's home phone number, because he would go there when, he draws Katharine Hepburn when she's in the stage production of Philadelphia Story. And he goes to her house, does it at 2:00 in the morning. She's sitting on her kitchen table. He was really a multifaceted artist who is highly collected now by, he's a museum quality artist, and museums acquire his work. It comes up at auction every once in a while. Oftentimes we hear from dealers a lot that people will sell their entire collections and keep their Soloways because they love they have a personal connection, because Ben had a very successful career. This is all that he did, and it's not because he came from family money or struck oil or won the lottery or anything like that. Neither did Ray. People liked his work, and so he didn't have a gallery or representative. If you wanted to buy a painting, you came here. Well, once you came here, you sort of fell in love with the place and them, and it was. I don't think it was a marketing strategy of his. I think he was very much who he was, but it worked for him, and it worked up until the day he died. And worked to the point that Ray didn't have to worry about selling paintings after he died.
And had you gotten to know him at all when you were a kid? And he died when you were maybe
he was
10 or
about
12,
ready
right?
to do our portrait. When you got to be 12 or 13 in the family, somebody commissioned a portrait. Oh. And Ray told me later that he was looking forward to doing, it was going to be a double portrait of me and my twin brother. And while he couldn't tell us apart, he knew that once he got us up on the model stand, that he'd be able to tell the differences in our personality. And of course, from now, that would have been a really valuable experience. So I have to admit, I was 12 years old when he died, and I didn't have much use for him, and I'm pretty sure he didn't have much use for me. But his wife was really an extraordinary woman who was his primary model and muse. And I think a lot of people kept Ben Soloway in their life because Ray Soloway was part of the package. She was a beautiful woman who had a great way with the English language, and just a beautiful inside and out in every way possible. And I got to know her very well. And was with her when she died.
Last question, and it's a meta sort of thing, because that's my thing. What's your career taught you about reputation within art? Your life's work, it seems, largely around Hirschfeld, is somebody we see decade plus after his death. He's still going strong, as it were. And yet a lot of the subjects are people we can't identify necessarily at a glance. What have you learned about that sort of reputation and about artists' reputation overall, and what makes them last?
What you learn is that nothing is eternal. The things that we think are so important today turn out to be not very important later on, and the artists or the people that we think are so important today, 50 years from now, most people won't know who they are. I mean, it'll be really
I think you're
obscurity.
overestimating on that one. I think maybe 5 years from now.
Right. Well, exactly. Well, we live in a accelerated age, and that's been going on for much of the 20th century. I mean, once the Industrial Revolution started, we just started moving at a faster pace. And so people don't know as much as they used to. But what I see is art that still resonates with audiences is art that is very good. And so, again, you and I look at Hirschfeld's work and we respond to not only the drawing, but to the subject. Future younger audiences today and future audiences will have no connection to the subject. It's ephemeral. Carol Channing and Hello, Dolly is there's tape of it, but there's nothing like that experience. Hirschfeld drew a world that was literally disappeared the moment it was over. And even the film work, what he was doing was, we can look at the films, but people don't look at films in the same way, again, that you or I did. When we were younger, if you wanted to see a classic film, you had to wait till a repertory house showed it. And it was an event. It was going to be on TV, and you sort of Thursday night at 11:30, it's going to be on. And it was an experience. Well, now that they're available all the time, anytime, it's no longer an experience. It's something you can dabble in that's not very interesting. But when you stayed up till 11:30 at night, damn it, you were going to watch the end of it because you wanted to, this was it. This was your chance. So I think in terms of reputation, it's hard to say, because we can see time and time again, people's careers are revived at some point. Sometimes while they're still alive, and they've disappeared, and they come back. But oftentimes after they die, their career is revived by an enterprising individual. I mean, life is very much about marketing, in that sense. Even an artist of the impact of Hirschfeld, if we did not have the Al Hirschfeld Foundation, he would disappear. I mean, because you need to have someone actively promoting the work. Ben Soloway would disappear. But so many of these artists that I've talked about would disappear because nature has endowed us with so many artists. And there's always going to be great artists. That's just human nature. And they're going to be doing work of their particular period. The great work will last beyond that. But it doesn't matter. We want the art that's for us now. And if it's here 50, 60 years from now, even if we aren't, who cares? We want what's today. So I think that is the thing that plays a role is what you do with it. Hirschfeld didn't really care. He wasn't Hirschfeld and Soloway. The posterity was not important to them. They Al started the Hirschfeld Foundation in part because he thought it could be something that could do good. And we do that now. I mean, there's a whole curriculum in New York City schools that is completely based on his work. And we're getting ready to expand that to other schools in other parts of the country. We use his art oftentimes to bring audiences to smaller venues that struggle to find an audience. But when they have a Hirschfeld show, they get all these first-timers that have never been there before. And getting them through the door, and we've seen this time and again, getting somebody through the door the first time is the hardest thing. The second time, it's much easier because they have a sense of where they're going. And, I had a good time last time. Let me go again.
You got me to the Arts Union that time when you were doing the slideshow and the panel with Drew Friedman and a few other guys.
Yeah.
That was my first time there, and it was a Hirschfeld event.
Right. And so we have found that Hirschfeld's work can do that. Mm-hmm. And, Al had wanted the foundation to do exactly what he did, except new drawings. And essentially that's what we do. And we, through the website, through alhirschfeldfoundation.org, you can look up everything he ever did by performer, by production, by publication, by date, by genre. You can look up theater seasons. You can look up every year of Al's career, find out what he was doing and the drawings he did in that year. We want you to be able to find out what you're looking for, as well as the things you didn't know existed.
Yeah, I was bummed because I did look up David Leopold when I went to the site. I was disappointed that he never had a Leopold drawing.
The only argument I ever got into with Al was over a drawing that I wanted to buy, and he wouldn't let me. He wanted to give it to me. And I said I couldn't really do that because, I'm
of interest.
A conflict of, it's museums are very church and state, and anything that you seem to benefit from, they really can't have you do. And I respect that. And I said, no, Al, I have to buy it. And no. And we literally got into an argument about it, which I lost. His wife came in and said, no, you have to take the drawing. And I said, okay.
2-1.
Yeah, right. They ganged up on me. As usual, it was dark and they were big. And, but I lost my train of thought.
Something in that is about you or the drawing itself?
Oh, so the drawing. So Al would have done a portrait of me had I just asked. I mean, literally, if I had said, Al, would you do a drawing of me? He would have done a drawing of me. But I also understood, and people take for granted that artists can do what they can do. And we don't go to an accountant and say, well, just do my taxes. You do it all the time. It's just what it is. We don't go to a manufacturer of suits and say, oh, it's just another suit. Just give me a suit. It's what they do for a living. And I have a great deal of respect for that with artists. And I didn't want to ask him for a freebie. And at the same time, I didn't have the money to pay for it. But I was just about ready to sign. I did a big book on Irving Berlin for Abrams about 10 years ago that turned out very well. And I got a decent advance on that. And I said, when I sign that contract, I'm going to go to Al and say, I need an author's photo, because that way it would be business. And that way I could pay him to do it.
Yeah.
I had it all figured out. Turned out he was 99.5, and I just waited about a week too long. I literally signed the agreement about a week after he died. And I will say this: there is a number of ponytailed men in the backgrounds of his drawings of his later work that I will take credit for, because I'm a ponytailed man.
That's a pretty good legacy to leave behind.
Yeah.
To show up in the background of a Hirschfeld. So, David Leopold, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. This was great. Thank you.
And that was David Leopold. You can find out more about his work through the Soloway site, as well as the Al Hirschfeld Foundation. Now, those are soloway.com, and that's SOLOWEY, and alhirschfeldfoundation.org. Hirschfeld is HIRSCHFELD. And you really need to go get The Hirschfeld Century, a portrait of the artist and his age, which was from Knopf and has essays, text by David Leopold and a ton of Al Hirschfeld's artwork. Now, after our conversation, as I tend to do, I asked David, so, who are you reading? If you want the answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the show so you can get access to our new monthly podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. You can do that at patreon.com/VMSpod or at paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast, patron-only blog, a series of ebooks that I want to launch, and a lot more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine literary conversation. If you don't like Patreon, just go to paypal.me/VMSpod and you'll get a password to the same material through our website, fearofasquareplanet.com. Special thanks go out to Paul W. Jones, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Andrew Mason, and Zach Martin for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, this episode was recorded at the Ben Soloway Studio in Bedminster, Pennsylvania. It's about a 90-minute drive from my home, but no tolls, so yay. I did stop for coffee on the way down in the delightful artsy strip of Frenchtown, New Jersey, which I'd never heard of. It's right on the border of Pennsylvania. It was like being in Nyack, New York, in terms of neat little art area. I also stopped there on the way back for another coffee and a visit to a used bookstore on the way home, where I discovered that I had bought the let's see, the fourth volume of Clive James's memoirs used from the library of Elizabeth Gilbert, who apparently has a house nearby there and changed houses, had to get rid of a whole bunch of books, brought them to that bookstore. This is what the clerk told me, at least when I bought it. So I have Elizabeth Gilbert's former copy of North Face of Soho by Clive James, and that's something that to hang my hat on, I suppose. So mainly, this show cost gas, time, and some coffee. Story of my life. But if you want to help defray some of that, visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a donation. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. Dave's got a reunion project going with his great 80s band, David and David. You can find out more and support that at facebook.com/DavidandDavidMusic. And that is it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thank you so much for listening, especially to my interminable rambling at the beginning. Next week's guest should be Cliff Nesteroff, author of The Comedians, Drunks, Thieves, Scoundrels, and the History of American Comedy. We haven't recorded it yet, but he seems solid, and I think I'll be able to make it to the venue we're supposed to do. He is also a Drew Friedman connection, which I just love. You know, Drew will drop me an email out of the blue saying, "You got to interview my pal Cliff. You know, here's his email. Go connect with him." We're also going to have a short segment with Liz Hand, who was on last summer. She has a new novel coming out next week in her Cass Neary series. It's called Hard Light, and I loved the first two Cass Neary books, so we're going to talk a little about that and preview that for you. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter at vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for it. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Until next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.